Okay, I've said what I wanted to say about burden of proof. It may come back up in particular cases, but what I'd like to do today is three things. First of all, I want to talk about an area which really is very, very difficult, subtle, complicated. I want to skim the surface and give you a couple of pointers about how to think about it. And then I want to talk about headlines, the way things are described in the press in such a way as to manipulate you, manipulate your emotions, to manipulate your mind, to draw conclusions that aren't warranted. And then I want to introduce a very important question of what counts as knowledge, how much you have to verify whatever it is that you want to defend that it is correct. The difficult area is probability and statistics. That area is poorly understood, even by people who ought to know better. The Economist had an article maybe 12 years ago where they surveyed people in the medical profession. They asked them questions about the probability of this cure and that cure and statistics and so forth and so on. And people who are deciding life and death issues for patients made legions of errors, just mistaking what probability means and what statistics means. It was really quite shocking. And what I want is an illustration of a story that was printed in The Economist. Now, I think it was a true story. Maybe they made it up. I think it was a true story. The story concerns a student who took a test for AIDS. And the result came back positive. And on the blurb of the test, it says, this test has 4% false positives. So he said, aha, I came back positive, and there are 4% false positives, so that means that it's 96% that I have AIDS. And he committed suicide. But he made a mistake because he didn't know what 4% false positives means. Here's what it means. When you do a test, you'll have some positives and some negatives. And then the test isn't perfectly accurate, so you divide the positives into the false positives and true positives, and the negatives into true negatives and false negatives. If you take the true and false positives and the true and false negatives all together, you get 100%. 4% false positives means of the 100%, 4% are false positives. Now, if you're testing for a disease, the vast majority of results are going to be negative. The vast majority of people don't have the disease. Right? So let's say you have 4% false positives. How many true positives are you going to have? Well, true positives would be people who really have the disease. You know roughly how many people there are in the population who have the disease. Let's say 1%. So of your sample, if 4% are false positives, 1% of the whole sample is going to be true positives. And 95% are going to be negatives. Okay, this guy tested positive. So the 95% of negatives don't count for him. He tested positive. The question is, how bad is that? Well, 4% of the whole are false positives, and 1% of the whole are true positives. So it means if you get a positive result, the chances of you having the disease are 1 in 5. Not 96%. It's 1 in 5, right? Because let's say you have 100 people, right? So of the 100 people, 5 get positives. Of the 5 that get positives, 4 are mistakes, and 1 is true. So it means it's a 1/5 probability that he has the disease. The 95% got negatives. And by the way, they make these things in such a way that the positives are exaggerated because they don't want to miss anybody who has the disease. They'd rather have more false positives. What happens then is you do a subsequent test, which is much more expensive, is much more accurate. So you have very few false negatives. So he just, poor guy, made a mistake in understanding what the figures meant, and he killed himself because of it. Okay, that's an extreme example. What I want to tell you now is that there's a type of statement in probability and statistics which you have to always raise a red flag, and that's comparative. This is more probable than that. This is 10 times as probable as that. And I'll tell you why. Let's suppose you say, here's a food which is dangerous. And it's dangerous because if you consume this food, you are 100 times more likely to get cancer than if you don't. Boy, that sounds pretty serious. But let's say that if you don't eat the food, your chances of getting cancer are 1 in 10 million. And if you do eat the food, then your chances of getting cancer are 1 in 100,000. You probably won't worry about that too much. 1 in 100,000? Now, 1 in 100,000 is 100 times larger than 1 in 10 million. But if you don't know the absolute numbers, you don't know whether to worry about it or not. So the minute you see a statement like this, you should be suspicious. They're covering it up. They don't want me to know the truth. Now let's take COVID. Early on, when they're talking about side effects of the vaccine. So I saw the following thing published. They compared the Pfizer COVID vaccine with other flu vaccines. And there are certain quite serious side effects. And the Pfizer vaccine had 5 times the rate of other flu vaccines. 5 times the rate. Wow. It's 5 times as bad. That's terrible. The others had 2 per 100,000, and Pfizer had 10 per 100,000. Now, are you worried? Hope not, because it's still 1 in 10,000. Right? So 5 times as much doesn't tell you anything. When they tell you it's a greater probability, or so and so many times the amount of probability, the alarm bells will start ringing. They're hiding something from me. If they don't give me the absolute statistics, they're hiding something from me. And that's you get that all the time. Now, consider a headline like this. We have discovered evidence that using cows may have an influence on global warming. Now let's see. Evidence doesn't mean it has to be true. Sometimes you have evidence that doesn't pan out. And then it's evidence that using cows may, not will, but may have an effect. What kind of effect? How big effect? So the headline is triply vague, triply protected against getting into trouble. But you hear global warming. Oh my God. Cows and global warming. Oh, I'm going to become a vegetarian. Right? I would rewrite the headline like this. We have discovered evidence, which may or may not turn out to be correct, that using cows may, or may not, because that's what may means, may or may not, have an effect whose size we can't calculate on global warming. If you wrote the headline that way, nobody would be worried about it, and no one would read it, and no one would send it to their friends. So they do this on purpose. They're not lying, but they create the words in such a way that you hear cows and global warming, oh my God, I'm going to become a vegan. And you don't take into account, it's possible that. It might be that. So I would write, it might or might not be that. All of a sudden, you don't feel so worried about it. Right? It might or might not be. Yeah, okay. Most things are like that. It might be, might not be. Who knows? Right? But when you say it might and put it positively, and then your mind leaps to the conclusion So you're being manipulated. And you have to stop and ask yourself exactly what is being said. Aside from the lies that are propagated out there, there's a wonderful short, one of the 5-minute documentaries on 97% of climate scientists say that human activity causes global warming. That's just totally untrue. It's totally untrue. And in this video, they go through the original research where the figure came from, and they show the criteria the author used, and they show the way in which he classified the papers that he was counting, and the kinds of vocabulary that he used, and it turns out to be just a fantasy. The whole thing turns out to be a fantasy. So, especially when it comes to these kinds of probabilistic statements, I think you have to be very, very cautious. Now, the big topic that I want to introduce, I have a whole chapter in my book on this, is this. What does it mean to know something? If someone knows something, he can't be just guessing. I say it's going to rain tomorrow. Really? Why did he say that? Because I flipped a coin. Heads, sun, tails, rain, and it came up tails. I think the observer will say he doesn't really know. If he made up his mind by flipping a coin, he doesn't know. To know means you got good reason to think it's true. Okay, so the question then is, how good must the reason be? Now there's a certain dialogue which takes place a lot, which assumes a certain standard for the evidence, and I think that the assumption is unrealistic. And here's how the dialogue goes. I believe in Q. Why do you believe in Q? Is it because of A, B, and C? Someone says, A, B, and C? Isn't it possible that even with A, B, and C, Q is wrong? Let's see. Is it still possible? Did A, B, and C rule out every other possibility? Or another way it's put is, how do you know it's not T? You say it's Q. How do you know it's not T? All of these invite the defender of his belief to present an absolute proof that he's right. A proof that's infallible, can't be wrong, necessarily true. Because all you're using to question him is imagination. Maybe it's E.T. Prove to me it's not some extraterrestrial life that's taking advantage of us. Prove it's not that. All he's doing is using his imagination and asking you to rule out every imaginable possibility other than yours. Well, suppose I can't do that. Does that mean that I don't really know? Does it mean that my believing what I believe is just guessing? Or is there some room in between where between, on the one hand, knowing for sure like 2 + 2 is 4, and on the other hand, guessing by checking tomorrow's weather by tossing a coin? Is there some room in between for better and worse? Is there some room in between for saying that you have enough to say that you know, even if it's still possible that you're wrong? Let's take some examples. Where are your keys? They're on the table. How do you know? Because I remember leaving them there. Does your memory ever fail you? Well, yeah, it fails me about, what I had for breakfast 16 years ago. It just failed me about that. But where my keys are when I left there 2 hours ago, not usually. I mean, maybe somebody hypnotized you in between and then he covered it up by making you forget it and really made you think that. Do you know that didn't happen? Come on, that's bizarre. Why are you bringing up something as bizarre as that? Saying it's bizarre doesn't rule it out. It's still possible, so you don't really know. Well, let's see. You say I don't really know. Are you then going to classify what I'm doing as guessing? where my keys are? Does that sound reasonable? That because I might have been hypnotized, therefore I could be wrong, and therefore I'm just guessing? Let me ask a question about your own life. Do you know who your parents are? How do you know who your parents are? They told you, and you trusted them. How quaint. Don't you know that there are parents who adopt children and who tell them that they're natural-born children? I look like my parents. That's because when they went down to the orphanage, they took their baby pictures. And they looked for a baby who looked like their baby pictures. That's why you look like them. I did a DNA test. Well, first of all, I know you didn't. And second of all, how do you know that these people, I can't call them your parents, that's prejudice now, these people didn't pay off the lab to lie to you about the results? Isn't it still possible that they're not your parents? So you think, golly, first of all, this guy's crazy. But aside from that, yeah, I guess it's possible. Well, then you don't really know. You don't really know. So you say, oh, gosh, I'm not sure what you mean by knowledge. I'm not sure what kind of standards you want me to live up to. But then if he says, so you're just guessing, that's surely wrong. I have a raft of evidence. The fact that they told me, and almost always when parents tell children that what they're saying is true, about this anyway, and the idea of them paying off the lab to lie to me about the DNA test is bizarre. Right? So surely someone who has all of this evidence is not just guessing. Now contrast that with a person in an orphanage, a child in an orphanage. He's 11 years old. Two people walk in and they say, "You're our child." Well, excuse me. I didn't grow up in their home. I don't know them from Adam. I don't know what their agenda is. I don't know whether they're reliable people or not. They're total strangers. If I jump to the conclusion and say, "Hello, Mom and Dad," someone could say, "You're really jumping to a conclusion. You don't have all the evidence that normal people have. They just said so. Maybe they're just looking for a child to adopt and they want to, create a nice impression on you." So there are different levels of evidence that you need to have to say whether you're just guessing or whether what you're saying could be called knowledge. That's why I called my book Reason to Believe. Because what you need to defend a belief is reason, and reason has standards, and the standards don't have to be the standards of infallibility. Let me try to tell you this in a slightly different way. I'm a professional philosopher, and although my field was philosophy and mathematics, I did read some ancient philosophy. Plato is famous for writing dialogues about someone named Socrates, who was the big star of the Greek philosophical tradition. Plato was his student, and Aristotle was his student. And many of the dialogues start like this. Well, take the Meno. Socrates is sitting in the marketplace. Someone he knows is coming by, and he seems to be in a hurry. He says, "Oh, where are you going?" "I'm going to the court." "Really? You have a court case? What's happening?" He said, "I'm prosecuting my father for murder." "What? Prosecuting your father for murder?" "Yes. A slave did something wrong, and he tied him up, and he said he was going to come back later, and he didn't come back, and the slave died, so I'm prosecuting my father for murder." "Wow," says Socrates. "Phew, you must know what good and evil are, and right and wrong are, and justice and injustice to prosecute your father. You must be clear on what morality is, what morality says, and so on and so on. Let's discuss it for a while and see how clear you are. Let me ask you some questions about this subject and see whether you really do have it clear." And of course, then he engages him in a dialogue, and he ties Meno in knots. And he doesn't answer any questions. And after the discussion, the guy says, "Well, I'm late for the court. I'm going." Socrates says, "You're still going to prosecute your father for murder, even though you don't know what good and evil are, and you don't know what justice is. Like, no. See, he's making fun of him and making fun of non-reflective people. Now, one of the 20th century critics said Socrates is playing a game. He's playing the following game. He meets somebody who says, I believe in Q, and he says to him, me, Socrates, I don't know anything about Q. I'm completely neutral. I have no opinion about Q. But you say you know. So let's check whether you really know. To know means you must have a good reason. Let's see whether you have a good reason. So Socrates presents himself as having no commitments and no liabilities. He's not putting anything forward. He's just examining the believer in Q to see whether he makes it or doesn't make it. Well, that's a lie. Because Socrates, in asking his questions and in drawing the conclusion, if you can't answer my questions, then you don't know what you're talking about, Socrates is using a criterion for how much you have to know. And you might throw that back in Socrates' face. You're asking these questions, why must I answer these questions? Who says if I can't answer these questions, I don't know? Who told you which questions to ask and what answers to accept? You're not here without commitments. You're committed to a certain standard for knowledge which you're forcing me to live up to. Maybe your standard for knowledge is unreasonable. There's always a give and take in these kinds of dialogues. So one of the things that it's important to do is to try to get some sense of how much reason is good reason, and to be able to show that demanding absolute certainty is a mistake. Now, when I say this, there was a time when this would be going uphill against the philosophical tradition. Descartes was one of the great founders of modern philosophy, and this was his standard. His standard was, if you can imagine any alternative, then you have to wipe it out. You have to rule it out. And if you can't rule it out, then you don't know. He even wanted to challenge mathematics. 2 plus 2 is 4. Couldn't there be an evil demon with supernatural powers who's causing you to believe that 2 plus 2 is 4 even when it isn't? Can you rule out the evil demon? No? Well then, it's possible you're wrong. And since it's possible that you're wrong, you don't know. And he actually pushed to the ultimate, in a certain sense. Maybe you don't know that you exist. Because if there's an evil demon, he can cause you to believe things that just aren't true, including that you exist. He raised that question. So you see how seriously he took the challenge. And the way he defeats it is very, as I say, slick. It's very slick, and it has occasioned a great deal of discussion and debate down through the centuries. He says, I want to see if you can cause me to doubt that I exist. The test of whether I know something or not is whether it's possible to doubt it. If it's impossible to doubt it, then it's got to be true. So now, could I doubt that I exist? Well, let's see. I'm thinking, and if I'm thinking I exist, because there's going to be somebody there who's doing the thinking. Now, am I really thinking? Well, could he cause me to doubt that I'm thinking? Well, reflect. Doubting is a kind of thinking, isn't it? Doubting is a kind of thinking. So you can't doubt that you're thinking. By the very fact that you're doubting, you are thinking. So now you've got something which is absolute. It can't be doubted. And from there you can build out conclusions. Okay, that's what Descartes started. Almost everyone has abandoned Descartes because they have found that delivering reasons that are immune to doubt is very, very difficult. And that being the case, if you set this as the standard for knowledge, it'll turn out that there isn't any knowledge. Now you may say, well, okay, that's what comes out. That's what comes out. Why are you prejudiced against that conclusion? And the answer is, I'm not prejudiced against that conclusion. I just want some reason to accept this criterion. It's certainly not appropriate for you to march in and say, I've created a criterion for knowledge, absolute infallibility. And since you can't meet it, you don't know anything. A quite reasonable response would be, you created it, go drink bourbon or something. Leave me alone. What do you created it? Why should I pay attention to what you create? Do I have to follow the rules that you create? What's the claim to fame of this criterion? That has to be absolutely infallible. What does it explain? What does it enable me to understand? What conclusions can I draw from it? It's just, that's a prejudice. So now the question will be, what counts as a good enough standard? Now, this is very greatly debated, and there's a lot of vagueness in the discussions. But we make decisions like this all the time, especially when we're making practical decisions. I inherited money from an unknown donor. I have money to invest in the stock market. What stock shall I buy? No guarantee of anything. But I don't decide which stocks to buy by taking the Wall Street Journal and putting it on a dartboard and throwing 6 darts and then taking the companies where the darts landed. I don't do that. Yes, when I make my economic analysis or I trust that of others, people make mistakes. But on the average, they do a lot better than people do who are doing it randomly. So that can give me good reason to invest my money. The question will be, what are the alternatives? Medicine sometimes, tragically, doesn't have complete answers to questions. And there can be alternate therapies. And you can have different schools of thought. Which therapy is better? And you have statistics, but then statistics are tricky, like I mentioned to you before. And people take back statistics. And statistics apply to classes of cases. And you may know something about yourself where you're not typical for the class. So therefore, the statistics of the class shouldn't apply to you. So it's going to be different for you than from others. This is all part of gathering information. And when you have to make a choice, this therapy or that therapy, because you know from experience that if you have neither therapy, then you're going to die, then it's a matter simply of superiority. I have enough evidence to trust this one as the right one for me to try when it has better evidence than the other one. When you don't have to make a choice, then the question will be, what makes up your mind? It's a subtle, difficult question. Why do you make up your mind at all? Let's just wait for more evidence to come in to settle it, or wait until it becomes practical. I'm not going to go there. But when you are talking about the decision of religion, there you have to. It's very much like medicine, because a religious decision for the religions of the Western world, I'm not conversing with all the religions of the world. Usually, a religion carries with it a certain regimen of action. Usually, the way the religion is built is this way. It tells a story about things that happened, and then because those things happened, here are the things that must be done. So, for example, we have a story about a revelation at Mount Sinai, and about subsequent information coming from the Creator, and prophets communicating from the Creator. That's a story about facts. If that story is true, then there's a whole raft of things that I should be doing. And if it weren't true, then I wouldn't have a reason to be doing those things. So when I'm trying to figure out whether I have adequate reason to believe the Jewish story, this isn't just a matter of abstract commitment to this history or that history. It's going to have the consequence of living one way or another. And that puts a kind of gradation on how much reason you need to make this decision. The question will be, in the case of, let's say, Judaism, what are the alternatives that you're deciding among? And I think at the outset, a person could say, well, there are the major world religions, and there are atheistic positions. And my decision has to be among those. So then what you want is that the Jewish position should be two things. Number one, should be the best of the alternatives. And number two, it should be better than 50%. Because if it's less than 50%, then it's more likely to be false than true. And that's not going to be a good outcome. So that's why in my book, I actually do this. I actually do these comparisons. Some of it's done in summary fashion in the book, and as I've mentioned on my website, I have another 150 pages where I do this with respect to other religions and some critics of Jewish history. So, when it's a question of deciding to accept the Jewish story of how the world came into existence and how it developed and the events that took place, and I'm going to use that decision to determine how I'm going to live my life, so then good reason means good enough reason to make that decision. Now, how good is that? Well, as I said, it's got to be better than the alternatives, and it should be over 50%. Is that vague? Yeah, it's vague. But it's certainly not the same as being infallible, and it's certainly not the same as just guessing. Now, are we together so far? Okay, so now there are people who say, look, you're talking about making practical decisions. For many people in many circumstances, there are factors other than whether you're going to be right or wrong, which influence your decision. So let's take an example. Philip has certain physical symptoms, and he goes to the doctor. The doctor does a workup, and he says, Philip, I've got good news and bad news. Bad news is you're sick. Philip says, I knew that. I could tell by the way I felt. Good. And the symptoms you have are characteristics of two diseases, A and B. All right? And there's a surefire cure for A, and there's a surefire cure for B. So that's the good news. Philip says, okay, doc, but you left out one piece of information. What's the probability that I have A, and what's the probability that I have B? And the doctor says, that's my last piece of bad news. The probability is 52 to 48%. Oh, and A and B are incompatible cures. If you take both of them, you'll die for sure. Wow. So what should Philip do now? So the normal thing to say is, take the cure for A. It's 52 versus 48. It's not a big difference, but it's 4% more greater probability that you'll live. Okay. But now, up until now, we've been assuming that the cures are free. Suppose that isn't true. Suppose that the cure for B is free, but the cure for A costs money. How much money? Well, you can have a sliding scale of cases. $1,000, $10,000, $100,000, $1,000,000, $10 million. Is there a cutoff point where you would say, I'm not willing to spend that amount of money for A, even though it gives me 4% greater probability of life? Because $1 million isn't worth gaining a 4% extra probability of life? Now, people divide here. Some people say, what good is $1 million? I'm going to be dead. So, of course I would pay $1 million for it. Other people say, no. The difference of 4% isn't worth going into debt head over heels for the rest of my life. So, this person is telling you not only whether he's right or wrong counts, the cost of being right counts. And it could be for him, he will believe it's the appropriate choice for him to choose the one that's wrong or could be wrong so as to avoid the cost. Now, if a person takes that point of view, and I can't rule it out, I don't know any philosophical argument that would rule that out. And suppose he says, well, Rabbi, I'm investigating Judaism, and it seems to me that Judaism has a considerable cost. So it was not good enough for me that Judaism's probability is 52% and all the other alternatives are less. Given the cost that Judaism has, it better be 70% or 80%. Otherwise, I don't think it's worth the cost. So I said to him, well, what do you think the cost is? I mean, why you imagine such a cost? Well, I can tell you that one of the things I do on the side to earn money is I run guns to Hamas. And I think following the Torah and joining the Torah community is just, it's not going to go. It's not going to be acceptable. You're right, it won't be acceptable. So I got to give up my income. So that's a big loss, right? So again, I don't know how to argue to such a person that his taking into account the cost is a mistake. But I could question whether his estimate of the cost is realistic. Yes, given where you are situated now, given your lifestyle now, and imagining adopting a traditional Jewish lifestyle is a challenging thought. There are a lot of adjustments that would have to be made, priorities would have to be shifted, and maybe certain plans would have to be modified or even given up. That's true. But when you look at the quality of a Jewish lifestyle and the probability of avoiding tragedies in life, like drug addiction, like violence, like divorce, like family breakdown even without divorce, like suicide, all the statistics which show that the traditional Jewish lifestyle creates a quality of life which is markedly superior to alternative standards of life. So then when you talk about the cost, you have to talk about the benefit also. You can't just list the costs in terms of what it will cost you to make the transition. And if you look at the tens of thousands of Jews who have made the transition in the last 50 years, and that's not an exaggeration, some think there are hundreds of thousands, but there are certainly tens of thousands who have made the transition and managed to make it successfully and make it with the kind of outcome that they preferred. So it shouldn't be regarded as something extraordinarily difficult or impossible for you to achieve. So, but I'm just pointing out that taking the cost into account, I don't know of any way of ruling that out categorically. And that's why I think that an exploration of Torah Judaism requires experience. It's not just enough to look at the arguments in the books. Because for many people, you aren't going to make your decision only on the basis of the arguments in the books. Part of your decision is going to be, can I fit into this lifestyle? And what will it cost me to make the transition? And if you don't have that experience, you won't know that. And that is relevant to the way you, in fact, are going to make your decision. So you'll be crippling yourself if you don't provide yourself with that kind of information. That's one type of argument. The other type of argument, which I think is very important, is this. Let's go back to the 52 and 48. There are people who will tell you, I have to make a decision. It depends upon the consequences of the decision. If the consequences are really big, then I want to have very strong support for the decision that I make. If they're relatively small, then maybe, a few percentage points advantage would be enough. But if it's life and death, or it's who I'm going to marry, or shall I take the injection or not take the injection, but where the consequences are large, then I want to have 70%, 80%, not just 52%. Now, if you've been paying attention, you already know that that's a mistake. Go back to poor Philip with his two diseases, A and B. The situation there is, if he has A, he must take cure A. If he has B, he must take cure B. He can't take both. If he takes both cures, he's going to die for sure. If he takes no cure, he's going to die for sure. This is life and death. And it's 52-48. Should he say, no, 4%? No. I can't make a life and death decision of 4% and then do what? Take neither one? Surely that's not the right outcome. Well, should he flip a coin? Why should he? A is 52 and B is 48. So the size of the consequences play no role whatsoever in how much probability you have to make the choice. Where size of consequences might matter is where the different choices have different consequences. I just said it's life and death on both sides. Or who you marry is on both sides. But what if, on one side, if you get it right, you get a gigantic payoff, and if you get it wrong, you get a small penalty, and the other side is the opposite. Then you might go for the first one, even if it's 20%. Because you got a 20% shot at a tremendous advantage, and an 80% shot at something which is not so terrible. So here, even though I'm most likely not getting it right, but the payoff is so big that it's worth taking the risk. That's when you have two alternatives, A and B, and the consequences aren't equal. They aren't balanced. And that happens in life also. Well, in the case of the Torah, if the Torah is true, the consequences are gigantic. Your whole life takes on a transcendental meaning. And from our point of view, it's not only life here, but it's an afterlife also, an infinite and eternal afterlife. The consequences are gigantic. And if the alternative is a secular lifestyle, it's the ups and downs of ordinary life. So this calculation, where I just presented it, would mean that you should choose the Torah over a secular lifestyle, even if the probability of the Torah lifestyle, the Torah being true, is low. This is what's called Pascal's wager. Pascal was a famous French mathematician and logician, and he made this wager for Christianity, and he pushed it to the wall. He said, even if there's no evidence at all, the mere fact that Christianity is possible means you should be Christian. Why? Because Christianity promises everlasting, joyous life. And a shot at that is worth it no matter how improbable it is, when your alternative is living in Beverly Hills. So clearly you should choose Christianity even if there's no evidence that it's true, just on the basis that it's possible. So the response to Pascal, the reason why I don't use Pascal in my book, is because they said, yeah, that's correct, but there are other alternatives which also make similar promises, and you can't have both. Islam says a similar thing about its promises. If you live up to Islam, and you can't live up to Islam and Christianity both. So if on the basis of Christianity possibly being true, and it makes such a gigantic promise, any other system that possibly is true and makes a gigantic promise will be just as good, according to Pascal's argument, as Christianity. And therefore, Pascal's argument doesn't give you a criterion to choose which of the alternatives which make these promises. That's in the literature. There's another point which I add to it. I haven't published it, but I think it's correct. A person could say, well, okay, but that's only for those alternatives that make these enormous promises. But the secular alternative, which doesn't make those enormous promises, can't compete. I think that's a mistake. Because when we talk about enormous promises, they're enormous in that they provide something which we regard to be very valuable. Maybe unlimitedly valuable. If it's an eternal life of joyous happiness, it's valuable beyond limit. But it's my value that's being appealed to. After all, it's a question of my making the choice. I make the choices on the basis of the values that I have. Couldn't a secular person, a person who has no religious belief, have values that are unlimited? Couldn't a secular person say, doing this is a crime, and it's such a terrible crime, I would die rather than do it? Nothing could convince me to do it. Indeed, if it were a choice between the whole of humanity committing the crime or the whole of humanity disappearing, it'd be better for the whole of humanity to disappear. It's an infinite crime. It's an infinite crime. I don't see anything in philosophy to make such a possibility impossible. We're talking about your values, how you value things. You value things as more and less, and some things you would put an unlimited value on. So killing an innocent person. No, I don't do that. And other people shouldn't do it either. And even if he has 10 healthy organs that will save the lives of 10 people who need transplants, and if he doesn't die, they're all going to die, which is very unrealistic, but let's say so. It's still wrong to kill him. You don't kill people for that purpose. You don't do that. It's wrong. And if you save 100 people, save 1,000 people, you don't kill somebody to save somebody else's life. You don't do that. That's just unlimitedly wrong. Now then, it could be that following a particular religion will force a person to do something which, if his secular alternative were true, would be an infinite crime. So you can set up, even for the secular alternative, an equal choice on the basis of consequences. So Pascal's argument doesn't work to enable you to choose between competing religions, and it doesn't work to enable you to choose against certain types of secular alternatives, and therefore Pascal's argument is just not a good argument to use to settle these issues, and that's why I do it in terms of evidence rather than just mere possibility plus a gigantic promise. So there again is an example of an argument which is initially very plausible, and when you analyze it and you try to apply it, you see that it doesn't have the strength that it seems to have. Okay, so tomorrow I'm going to go further on this idea of presenting evidence and talking about the kind of evidence that's being presented and how one draws conclusions with it, taking for granted that we're not using the Cartesian standard of absolute proof or absolute infallibility, absolute certainty that you must be right, because that's just not the correct criterion for saying that you know something.